In The Sun Almost Rises, Ernest Hemingway describes bankruptcy in two ways: gradually and then suddenly, which is the perfect description for the collapse of the Soviet Union. Beginning in 1989 with both the withdrawal from Afghanistan, followed by the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then speeding up over the next 2 years, with Eastern Bloc countries and constituent republics declaring independence until the Soviet Union itself was dissolved in December of 1991. But the sudden collapse of the Soviet Union left a lot of problems to be resolved. Apart from trying to restructure the entire economy, they also had to deal with the physical remnants of the Red Army. In particular, the nuclear arsenal of the Soviet Union, of which 4 former Soviet states were in possession of at the time of dissolution: Russia, Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine. Since the dropping of the first atomic bombs, the US has been obsessed with preventing more countries from obtaining nuclear weapons, and the fall of the Soviet Union left Ukraine with the world's 4th largest arsenal behind the US, Russia, and China. President Bush spent much of his administration getting Mikhail Gorbachev to sign the START I treaty, followed up by START II with the newly independent Russian Federation. Boris Yeltsin, wanting the upper hand on all of Russia's former sister republics, began insisting that the entirety of the Soviet nuclear arsenal belongs to Russia. Out of practicality, President Bush agreed with his assertion, and his successor, Bill Clinton, would continue that policy with the bilateral negotiations between Ukraine and Russia beginning in the winter of 1993. A Russian delegation visited Kiev on January 12th in order to inform Ukraine about the details of START II. They would also deliver their own set of guarantees to Ministers Lenko and Tarasuk, who were so dissatisfied with them that they didn't share the details of it with Parliament. Despite that, they still voiced their support for START II and promised to expedite the ratification of START I, as well as the negotiations around the more technical aspects of disarmament. This was followed by a meeting between Yeltsin and Kravchuk in Moscow on January 15th, in which they agreed to move their negotiations to a bilateral format, despite the Lisbon Protocol requiring these negotiations involve Belarus and Kazakhstan as well. These developments worried the Democrats and reformers in the parliament, and so the People's Council held a meeting to chastise the president for bending to Russian demands, and for a while the administration seemed to change its tune. On January 23rd, there was a meeting in Minsk to approve a new charter for the Commonwealth of Independent States, which would have given a Russian-dominated Central Command control of Ukraine's nukes, which President Kravchuk refused to sign. This was followed by the first bilateral meeting between Russia and Ukraine over the technical aspects of denuclearization on the 26th. Representatives met in Irpin, Ukraine. The Ukrainian delegation was led by Yuri Kostenko, who had been made Minister of the Environment the previous fall, while the Russian delegation was led by Yuri Dubinin, a former Soviet ambassador to the United States. Kostenko would emphasize that the decision of how and when to disarm was the prerogative of Parliament, and that Ukraine needed compensation for the stolen tactical nukes, as well as security guarantees before they would begin dismantling the strategic nukes. Dubinin was notably aggressive, pushing the Russian propaganda line that Ukraine was trying to become a nuclear power in contradiction to its public statements. Russia claimed that Ukraine couldn't be the legal owners of the nukes if Ukraine had already promised to become a non-nuclear state, and thus Russia, as the only officially nuclear state signatory of START, was entitled to the nukes on Ukraine's soil. Dubinin would then threaten to stop deliveries of Russian-made parts for the Ukrainian nukes, as well as to stop deliveries of fuel for Ukraine's nuclear power plants if Kiev didn't agree to hand over its arsenal. Kostenko reminded Dubinin that Ukraine was the legal owner of the nukes on its soil according to the Lisbon Protocol. He then countered Dubinin's threats by threatening to cut off the supplies and technicians the Russian arsenal needed from Ukrainian firms. Dubinin deflected Kostenko's demands for compensation for the tactical nukes by claiming it wasn't on the agenda for the meeting, and then insisted that Russia had to stop servicing the Ukrainian nukes because its membership in the NPT didn't allow it to help a non-nuclear state obtain nukes. Dubinin then tried to get the Ukrainian delegation to sign an agreement for a schedule to deliver the nukes to Russia, the cost of which would be borne by the Ukrainians with no promise of compensation. He then tried to get the Ukrainians to sign an agreement forcing Ukrainian firms to continue servicing Russian arsenals, all the while they were trying to threaten to not have Russian firms continue servicing the Ukrainian ones. A second round of talks began in March in Moscow, where the Russians doubled down on their demands. Dubinin repeated the Russian position that Ukraine did not own the nuclear arsenal, and said that its insistence on security guarantees and compensation was a threat to international law and peace. The debate grew heated, and during one of the breaks, a Ukrainian representative told his colleagues that they should just walk out of the meeting. But Kostenko rejected this, saying that it would play into the Russian narrative that the Ukrainians were the ones at fault. When the talks resumed, Russia's Deputy Defense Minister, General Boris Gromov, announced that if Ukraine didn't renounce its ownership of the nukes, Russia would stop servicing them, to which Kostenko replied that they would find a third party in the West to do it. The Russians erupted into angry shouting, asserting that these were state secrets and that by allowing a foreign firm to service the nukes, that they would be exposing secret information. And you can assist me in delivering more information to you guys by signing up to the Casual Historian Patreon. Patreon is the best way for you to support this channel when the algorithm and sponsors aren't giving the channel a fair shake. And in particular, I would like to thank the newest patrons who have signed up since the last video: Dr. Suleiman, James, David, Nathan, and Lennox. Those who join the Patreon get access to a patrons-only Discord server, as well as access to early ad-free versions of these videos. You can also get access to the scripts and notes I use to make these videos as well. Bottom line is that I know most of the people support creators on Patreon like myself because they like what that creator creates, they think what they are making has value, and they want to see them make more. And the perks are mostly just a way for us creators to express our gratitude. And so, to all of my patrons, past, present, and future, thank you. With all that out of the way, let's get back to the history. When the topic of the tactical nukes came up, the Russian delegation refused to discuss it, claiming that they had not been informed about it, despite it being on the agenda at the meeting they were hosting. This was followed up by a demand that all the remaining nuclear warheads be transferred to Russia by August 1st. In reality, this initiative was an open provocation. The proposed pace of disarmament, 1.5 years, was extremely dangerous, both technically and for the domestic situation in Ukraine. We also knew very well that Russia itself was not technically prepared for the large-scale cleaning up of the nuclear weapons of the former Soviet Union. The technical capacities of Russia's enterprises were not sufficient to quickly ensure the processing and safe storage of the components of such a significant number of nuclear warheads. The meeting ended on March 5th, with no agreement signed. Russian media began reporting that Ukraine had decided to become a nuclear power, and that there would be an impending nuclear disaster on Ukrainian soil because they refused to disarm. Much of the international press began to accuse Ukraine of holding up the ratification of START 1 for monetary gain. After the international backlash, President Kravchuk began to backslide, pressuring Parliament to open debates on START 1 to ratify it. Instead, Parliament decided to hold a series of hearings from experts in order to educate themselves and the public. At the hearings, Kostenko argued that Parliament couldn't ratify the treaty for national security reasons, and international law experts elaborated on the potential legal consequences of the treaty, such as giving Russia ownership of the nukes that were in Ukraine, as well as giving them the right to command the units that were administering them. A final debate on the issue was scheduled for June 3rd, and throughout April and May, the government would receive international pressure to ratify START. The Clinton administration refused a meeting with Ukraine's newly appointed Prime Minister, Leonid Kuchma, while its embassy in Kyiv sent a memo to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs demanding that Ukraine dismantle the entirety of their nuclear arsenal, along with not replacing them with non-nuclear missiles, while Western newspapers began spreading fear of nuclear proliferation. The June debate finally arrived, and the working group, led by Yuri Kostenko, argued that there were too many unresolved concerns that could be detrimental to Ukraine's national security. Foreign Minister Anatoly Zlenko spoke in favor of ratification, arguing that not doing so would isolate Ukraine internationally and would give Russia a casus belli to invade. Today is the day to make a firm decision on the question of ratifying START and acceding to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Further delays in adopting the necessary decision will only lead to intrinsic damage of Ukraine's national interests. We are creating an image of Ukraine as an ambitious member of the international community and a state with excessive military ambitions. In spring last year, the tactical nuclear weapons were taken out of Ukraine with surprising haste. Today, Russia is even refusing to talk to us about any kind of compensation. Has the question of Ukraine's ownership of its strategic nuclear weapons actually been formalized under international law? I repeat, indeed, we can talk about Ukraine's right of ownership of its nuclear weapons. But that still doesn't mean actual ownership, because having the right of ownership and exercising this right are, of course, different things. As to guarantees of Ukraine's security, We're talking about the nuclear states adopting a political and legal document that would confirm their commitment to the unacceptability of any kind of use of force against Ukraine by the nuclear states. We have already received preliminary texts of such guarantees from the United States, Great Britain, the Russian Federation, France, China. I understand from your report that there is no actually signed document that would guarantee our national security. Right now, we do not have a single agreement about compensation, and so the external conditions for ratifying the treaty are really not there. If Start 1 is ratified without the external conditions being decided or clearly formulated in Ukraine's interests, then we will find ourselves facing the reality of being pressured right now. But then, after signing, we will be stripped naked. After hours of debate, Prime Minister Kuchma would close the session with his own statement. Given the density of nuclear power plants and toxic manufacturing across the country's territory and its geographic and geopolitical situation, Ukraine is vulnerable for any kind of aggression, and the consequences would be catastrophic for us. If we believe that complete nuclear disarmament will open the doors to loans and assistance from the West, this is probably a profoundly mistaken notion. The debate resulted in Parliament delaying the ratification of the START Treaty and that they would ratify it separately from the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Despite this, President Kravchuk remained pro-ratification. Russia's response was unsurprising. If this happens, Ukraine will become a nuclear state that is more powerful than Britain, France, and China, shaking up the already shaky nuclear non-proliferation process and setting a bad example. Russia doesn't need this kind of headache. Do the Americans? They don't either. However, the international response began to turn in Ukraine's favor, and one surprising voice in support of Ukraine was John Mearsheimer. If that name rings a bell to any of you guys, it's because this guy has gotten a lot of attention the last few years for supporting Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In a 2014 article in Foreign Affairs, he blamed the West for Russia's invasion and annexation of Crimea. But missing from this article is a condemnation of the West forcing Ukraine to denuclearize. Well, he published another article in Foreign Affairs back in 1993, not just arguing that Ukraine shouldn't give its nukes to Russia, but that they should actively maintain them as functional nuclear weapons. President Clinton is wrong. The conventional wisdom about Ukraine's nuclear weapons is wrong. In fact, as soon as it declared independence, Ukraine should have been quietly encouraged to fashion its own nuclear deterrent. Even now, pressing Ukraine to become a non-nuclear state is a mistake. The tune was also changing on Capitol Hill. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee, chaired by then-Senator Joe Biden, heard testimony from CIA Director James Woolsey. The relationship between Russia and Ukraine also threatens to stall Russia's progress in implementing the START agreements. Russia has set preconditions for exchanging START 1 instruments of ratification and for ratifying START 2. Russia's preconditions are that Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine must ratify START 1 and accede to the Non-Proliferation Treaty as non-nuclear states. Senator Biden would address the committee, commenting on what felt like an anemic response from the United States to the growing tensions in Eastern Europe. The West, acting in what I consider to be pathetic abandonment of the principles of collective security and of the U.S. Security Council resolution on Bosnia, could not offer assurances to the Ukrainian government that might give them a sense of security. The Security Council has not done itself proud thus far, and some of the same principles are at stake. The committee would also hear an impassioned testimony from Professor Yaroslav Belinsky from the University of Delaware. Senator Biden, sir, two nations have the greatest moral right to possess nuclear weapons: Israel and Ukraine. The leaders of Israel have wisely decided that one Holocaust was enough. Ukraine is the victim of Stalin's genocide and of cultural genocide under Khrushchev, Brezhnev, and Gorbachev. But for the grace of God, the people of Ukraine, with their 1,000-year-old history, would have been wiped off the map. No nation in the world can deny Ukraine's moral right to keep nuclear weapons to prevent another genocide, least of all the Russians, who, albeit indirectly, have profited from the physical and cultural genocide of Ukrainians. This change on Capitol Hill was matched by a change in the White House as well. U.S. Secretary of Defense Lee Aspin would visit Kiev after the debate and made an offer. The U.S. would assist in the separation of the nuclear warheads from their missiles and allow them to remain in Ukraine under international supervision. But just as things started looking up, things started to turn against the Ukrainians again. After the second bilateral meeting in March, the Russian Foreign Ministry complained to the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry that Yuri Kostenko was a bad actor whose presence at the talks was single-handedly preventing progress. So he was replaced with the newly appointed Deputy Prime Minister, Valery Smarov, a pro-Russian politician. When they met for the third round of negotiations in August, the Russians presented 3 agreements which called for Ukraine to deliver all of its warheads to Russia, and to let Russia control nuclear storage facilities in Ukraine. Shmarov would sign all 3. The Russians would bring these 3 signed agreements to a trilateral meeting in London between Russia, Ukraine, and the US. On September 3rd, Yeltsin and Kravchuk agreed to all 3 as the Massandra Accords, which stated that Ukraine needed to complete the transfer of its nukes to Russia within 2 years of Start 1's ratification. But not everyone in Kravchuk's government supported it. By late summer of 1993, Ukraine was in an economic and political crisis. Strikes by miners in the Donbass had begun back in June, demanding a referendum on both the president and parliament, which parliament agreed to, scheduling it for September 26th. But Prime Minister Kuchma would resign from his office on September 21st, which sent parliament into crisis, canceling the referendum and calling for early elections for both parliament and the president in 1994. Parliament would send a delegation to Washington to meet with various undersecretaries and representatives from the Pentagon, and the administration was open to working with them and offered them more support in exchange for more democratic reforms in Ukraine and wanted to maintain close contacts with them. However, the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry at this time was still more or less in the pockets of the Kremlin, and thus never followed up on these meetings. Another debate on Start 1 was scheduled for November 18th. The working group presented the same arguments from the June debate, pointing out the problems of ratifying both START and the NPT simultaneously. They also emphasized Ukraine's ownership of the nukes. They emphasized the original text of the START Treaty, which did not mandate either party completely eliminate their nuclear arsenals, and that it could be done gradually. Most importantly, they emphasized that START, the NPT, and the UN did not provide satisfactory security guarantees. The president had proposed legislation to ratify both treaties at once, but Parliament rejected it, and decided to ratify the START Treaty under condition its security guarantees were met. But it wasn't enough. By January 1994, the White House had changed its tune back to hostility towards Ukraine. Representatives from all 3 countries would meet in D.C. to hammer out the details for dismantling the nukes. Around this time, the Clinton administration was also pursuing its Partnerships for Peace initiative, which led it to appeasing Russian concerns in Europe. This was happening all the while Russia was reasserting its influence over former Soviet republics. With his timid approach toward the eastward expansion of NATO, Mr. Clinton already is being called overly sensitive to the security concerns of Boris Yeltsin and not sensitive enough to those of former Soviet dominions. His position on the Ukrainian nukes, even though inherited from the Bush administration, exposes him to a key question. Is the president on his European tour resisting or unconsciously abetting the rebirth of Russian imperialism? During Clinton's tour of Eastern Europe, the US, Russia, and Ukraine were in the middle of secret trilateral meetings, and the US president refused to visit Kiev unless a favorable result came from them. This meeting was being held without Parliament's knowing. The exact outcome is unknown, but it was enough for Air Force One to make an unscheduled stop in Kiev on January 11th. Presidents Clinton and Kravchuk would meet at the airport, after which they announced that they would sign an agreement with Yeltsin on the 14th. The two would meet with Yeltsin in Moscow and sign the trilateral statement, which made several promises that contradicted existing Ukrainian law. Transfer of nukes to Russia, destruction of nuclear infrastructure, no security guarantees, scheduled disarmament, and Ukraine would be on the hook for the entire bill. The US and Russian governments began broadcasting that all of Ukraine's concerns had been met, but Parliament would set up several committees to analyze the agreement. Another round of debates was held on February 3rd. The one thing preventing Ukraine from ratifying the trilateral agreement was Parliament's reservations about Article 5 of the Lisbon Protocol, demanding that they immediately join the NPT. The government spoke in favor of lifting the reservation. Some people, however, distort the facts, whether consciously or unconsciously, trying to uphold that Ukraine could supposedly become a nuclear state, and that this would strengthen its security and international standing, that nuclear weapons can safeguard our independence, territorial integrity, and future prosperity. It would also be a big mistake to also ignore Russia's reaction to a possibility of Ukraine becoming a nuclear state. You know that such eventuality is not only unacceptable to political and military leadership of that country, but also plays a role in creating populistic slogans for those who, having just prevailed in the Russian elections, are now advocating for turning Ukraine into new Russian provinces. After hours of debate and pressure from the executive branch, Parliament finally lifted its reservations about the Lisbon Protocol. A month later, the snap elections for Parliament were held, which resulted in many of the MPs that had opposed ratifying the trilateral agreement and Lisbon Protocols losing re-election. The new parliamentary speaker refused to establish a new working group to prepare Parliament to ratify the NPT. The eastern provinces mostly voted for the communists, while the western provinces mostly voted for Democrats and nationalists. This was followed by the presidential elections in June. The first round of voting saw incumbent Leonid Kravchuk win a plurality, but not a majority. The second round saw him put up against former Prime Minister Leonid Kuchma. Kravchuk accused Kuchma of being a puppet of the Russians, while Kuchma's campaign blamed Kravchuk for the state of the economy. Kuchma would pull out a win with 52% of the vote, mostly coming from eastern Ukraine, while Kravchuk's support came from the west. While this was going on, the Ministries of Foreign Affairs and Defense had begun shipping the strategic missiles to Russia without parliamentary approval and under the orders of Kravchuk. When Kuchma came into office, he couldn't stop the process. Considering it a near fait accompli, Kuchma submitted a bill to Parliament to ratify the non-proliferation treaty, and due to the Parliament election's results, organized opposition to the bill was decimated. On November 16th, Parliament ratified the bill, with 301 deputies voting in favor. In December, a conference was held in Budapest, where the US, Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine exchanged their ratification certificates for START 1. Ukraine also handed over the documents for its accession to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. At this meeting, the US, Russia, and UK signed the Memorandum on Security Assurances in connection with Ukraine's accession to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, known colloquially as the Budapest Memorandum. It prohibited the signatories from using coercion against Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, but it contained a line that basically made the whole agreement moot. It allowed political and economic coercion for self-defense, in accordance with the United Nations Charter. For years, officials inside and outside of Ukraine encouraged swift denuclearization, promising that if they had done this, that the Ukrainians would receive more international help out of sympathy. But in reality, once the nukes were gone, nobody cared about Ukraine. By 1996, the last of Ukraine's nuclear weapons were shipped off to Russia. Ukraine had been pressured to ratify START 1 and the Non-Proliferation Treaty so that the US and Russia could enact START 2. But the US Senate didn't ratify START 2 until 1996, and Russia didn't do so until the year 2000. The full disarmament of Ukraine, including missile silos and launch systems, wasn't complete until 2008. And in 2009, the US and Russia issued a joint statement promising to respect the Budapest Memorandum security assurances after the expiration of the START Treaty. When Russia invaded and annexed Crimea in 2014, Ukraine protested it as a violation of the Budapest Memorandum, which the G7 confirmed. Russia, however, refused to recognize the legitimacy of the new government in Ukraine after the pro-Russian regime was ousted in the Euromaidan revolution. Russia went so far as to claim that the West were the real violators of the Budapest Memorandum, accusing the Euromaidan protests of being an American-backed coup. Thanks again to my patrons for supporting this channel. You guys allow me to continue making videos like this, ignoring the algorithm. I'd also like to thank United24 for helping with some of the research of this video, as well as for providing some of the archival footage. If you would like to keep up with the ongoing events in Ukraine, go ahead and subscribe to their YouTube channel, link down in the description below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.